I'm going to give just a couple seconds here, but we'll probably just go ahead and jump right into it. So welcome. Today, we are going to cover the Community Needs Assessment for the Colorado CSBG Network. I am Alex Diaz, the program manager for the CSBG program with the Colorado Department of Local Affairs. I'm also joined by my colleague, Becky Sad, who is the program coordinator for the program with DOLA. And we also have our colleagues from the Colorado Community Action Association, Josiah Massengale, Executive Director, Liz Espinoza, Deputy Director, and Jessica Roshan. What is your title, Jessica? Remind me.
I'm Associate Director at CCAA.
Associate Director at the CCAA. Yes, we couldn't do what we do without them, so we're always extremely pleased to have you all here. And we will go ahead and jump right into it. So we're going to start with a high-level overview of some of the resources that we're going to provide. And first, of course, please note that the webinar is being recorded. We will post it on our website for review afterward for anyone who couldn't make it or anyone who needs to check back on anything. We encourage you to ask questions at any time. If you have them, you can just jump right in either in the chat or unmute yourself. And in the meantime, please be sure to keep yourself muted so that we don't have too much background noise. And then let's jump right into the resources. So the first resource, and probably the primary resource for a lot of folks as far as actually compiling the data, is going to be the CSBG CNA Template, the Community Needs Assessment Template. And this is basically a document that is optional. It is not required by any means, but I will say it does have a lot of super valuable information on the must-haves here. So we'll go over some of the points on this. You can certainly use your own template as long as all of the relevant organizational standards are met using your own template, and you can always use this template here for compiling data or presenting it to your tripartite board or advisory committee. And a completed community needs assessment accepted by the tripartite board and or advisory committee is due by October 1st, 2023. Along with the CSBG application in the DOLA grants portal, which has some other components as well. And the community action plan, of course, must tie directly to this community needs assessment. So important things to note while you're completing it is that the fillable fields that we've included in this document are generally required to be completed in your community needs assessment in order to complete all of the organizational standards. So if there's a fillable field below a question, that's our way of signaling that this is something that you really should answer as part of your community needs assessment, even if you do not use this specific template. Your community needs assessment should include basic demographic data for customers served and communities in the service area. And this includes poverty and its prevalence to age, gender, race, and ethnicity in the service area. Please note this is an and. Please try to include all of these components, age, gender, race, and ethnicity, in your analysis in order to really have a complete analysis and for us to be able to review it as such when we're looking at org standards. And the community needs assessment is going to provide the basis for your community action plan, which is effectively how CSBG funds will be used over the 2024 to 2026 period. And the subsequent strategic plan, which will be a component of the CSBG application. So those are both included in the CSBG application as fillable fields that will need to be completed prior to submission to DOLA. So if you're wondering, where do we do the community action plan or where do we do the strategic plan? Some folks only ever complete those things in the application in the grants portal, and that's where they live. So there won't necessarily be separate templates for the strategic plan, the community action plan. You're welcome to enter those directly into the grants portal when you're completing your application before October 1st. The community needs assessment and community action plan should both be reviewed by a nationally certified Roma trainer to receive input and feedback. Luckily, in our program between the state and the association, we have 3 at least trainers and some more folks working on it. So this is a really key piece. Make sure that once you've compiled your needs assessment, it is submitted to a Roma trainer, one of us 3 for review. And with enough time also to have that review and incorporate any changes that are suggested. So that's going to take a little bit of lead time. So the hard deadline is October 1st. But keeping in mind that we do have that review component that is required, it should really be completed in most of its entirety before that for Roma review and subsequent editing and any changes that may be needed. We do ask that you clearly identify the causes of poverty and the conditions of poverty, and we do make a distinction between those two. And further down the template, there is a definition that you can use that kind of guides how we are defining those things. So sometimes causes and conditions get lumped into one, but really we're asking for a separate analysis of the causes and the conditions separately. And of course, excuse me, if you are a multi-county service agency, then please include data for all counties in your service area as a part of your community needs assessment. So that's the handy dandy template. Hopefully it's helpful. If you have any questions, let us know. And we will proceed. Anything else you want to add about the template before we move on, Josiah? I love to spring surprise questions on him just to see if he's paying attention while he drives. All right, cool. I think we are good to go then. We will go ahead and proceed to the next resource on our first slide there, which is the DOLA CSBG grantee resources page, which we like to reference so often in regards to so many different things. And of course, it is a great resource for the community needs assessment as well. Yep, so if you go to the grantee resources, then you can see that there's a specific place for the community needs assessment resources. So this is where the webinar will be once it's been recorded and put up on the website, as well as the slides, which have all these handy links. These slides are really going to be a wealth of resources for you. So make sure that you save that somewhere where you can pull up those links and you can get that on our webpage. The NASCAS checklist, as well as the data hub, which we will talk about later. And then even more thorough is the Colorado Community Action Association's Community Needs Assessment and Community Action Plan Tools webpage, which this is the big one when it comes to all the resources being in one place for Colorado specifically. We'll go a little bit more into the Community Action Partnerships data hub there, but there's a wealth of resources. Don't do yourself a disservice by not really combing through all of the resources that are there, because from state resources to, these other entities, and even a section for EDI, equity, inclusion, etc. resources that are kind of a new perspective that we're taking on it this year, really trying to emphasize that. Lots of fantastic resources there for everybody to take a look at. So that's kind of the high level stuff that we're working with here today. We'll jump into some more of the specifics by starting out with the agenda. Josiah?
Thanks, Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. Really excited to kick off this process. Thank you for your time and effort through it. We're going to be talking about why we go through this process every 3 years. We'll outline what some of the key steps in the needs assessment really are, and what the role of your tripartite board/advisory committee is locally through this process. Of course, we're going to start out with evaluation and really look at how we performed in the past, and also looking at environmental scans and reviews and understanding what's going on locally. We'll look at data, both qualitative and quantitative, and data from other key sectors. We'll talk about how to look at the community resources available and analyze that. And we will also talk about how you can analyze diversity, equity, inclusiveness, and belonging issues locally and include that in the assessment. Finally, we'll end our hour here with an analyzation of the assessment and how that can be conducted to ensure that you have a very strong, very thorough product at the end of this process. And then, of course, we want to talk about how we communicate the results of this assessment. Alex.
Thanks, Josiah. So first and foremost, we'll talk about the reason that we do all of this, which is that it's outlined in the Community Services Block Grant Act. In addition to the fact that it's very useful and helpful, but this is a very compelling reason to do something. It's because the federal government tells you to. So of course, in the act, they ask that we secure from each eligible entity as a condition of receiving funding a community action plan that includes an assessment for the community served. So it's very clear we have to do this. And specifically, we've been charged with identifying the needs as they relate to the elimination of poverty in our specific communities, identifying community resources that are available or that may be threatened or that are not available, and developing a community action plan that indicates what we will do and what we will accomplish. So of course, while it's legislatively required, it is actually a really helpful tool, and it's not just a box checking exercise, but something that really helps us ensure that the services that we are providing and the strategies we're employing are needed and effective in our communities.
So what are some key steps in this process? Well, obviously you want to start with some parameters. You want to define what the community, what the areas served are. You want to identify what some of the needs that you might look at and start to identify what some of the assets and resources you're going to plan to look at are. How are you going to look at these things? Are you going to look at them around major domains or service categories such as housing and transportation and health and social behavioral development? Are you going to look at it around populations or at-risk and vulnerable populations locally, or some combination or otherwise? And what does it look like in your agency? How is this going to work in your agency or department as you go through the steps? And ultimately, how are you going to define your community? We're going to want to obviously then move on to an assessment plan, probably. Who's going to be on this team that's going to work on it? What is the budget that might go into this process if there is one? And what is a beginning wish list of some data that you all are going to plan to collect? Obviously, then you want to identify what data you're hoping to collect and how you'll collect that. And then start to put this in place and start to collect the data and analyze the data and be able to then look at data from past year's needs assessments, if available and appropriate, but also compared to what you've done in the past and what you were expecting to accomplish in the past. Ultimately, what we're hoping to accomplish through this process is to obtain factual and opinion-based input from leaders that will help us to then complete the next strategic planning process, which includes creating a community action plan and somehow driving into a local CSBG relevant mission statement, as well as a local CSBG relevant strategic plan. Alex mentioned, and we're going to emphasize this several times over the next hour, that the community assessment needs to include key findings on both the causes and the conditions of poverty and the needs of these communities served. And we'll talk more about what those causes and conditions are a bit later. And NASCASP, our National Association for State Community Services Programs partner, also has a very thorough guide to how a needs assessment process can be implemented. So we encourage you to check that out as well.
So as is the case with so many things in the Community Services Block Grant Program, the role of the tripartite board and/or advisory committee is key. So with the community needs assessment, there is still that requirement that the tripartite board or advisory committee fully participate in the development, planning, implementation, evaluation of CSBG through Roma. So given that this is a key part of the program, it is crucial that the tripartite board or advisory committee be involved in this as well. And that fact is laid out, of course, in the Act, as well as in OCS Informational Memoranda 82, which is, of course, not binding necessarily, but it is guidance that we are strongly encouraged to follow. And the OCS IM 82 in particular has some really good details for folks who want to know why and how the board needs to be involved. We strongly encourage you to read that IM so that you understand the tripartite and advisory committee's role in this whole process as well.
So let's talk more about that. You all, as the folks that are going to be leading this process from the agency or department side, will want to probably do some things with your tripartite board and keep some things in mind as you do this process. One is use existing data, both qualitative and quantitative, whenever possible. And we've tried to outline a lot of different data sources that you can tap into, as well as a lot of different places you might look for data, both locally and from a state or federal national perspective. And really, there's a lot of stuff out there that you can use and summarize and include in your needs assessment. And of course, we don't want you to recreate the wheel. Really try to get as much of this information to your tripartite board / advisory committee with time for them to review and really understand what information you're providing them. And then obviously you'll have to provide them a final community needs assessment for their acceptance. And it really helps the process along if you do this in stages. And so some data you might already have at your fingertips that you can analyze and get to your board right away and really kick off the process. And a lot of that data might be internal as well. Don't forget that we want to use our tripartite board and our advisory committees as key informant surveys. They are experts locally and their opinions carry weight. We always need to encourage ourselves and our tripartite board and advisory committees to, at the end of the day, be able to balance the needs and resources we're identifying in this process with the amount of CSBG funding and other leveraged and mobilized funds locally. CSBG cannot do everything for everyone. And so we really want to be able to focus the CSBG funding and its impact as much as possible. And this is the first part of that process. Again, the needs assessment must be formally accepted by your tripartite board / advisory committee. And additionally, we want to make sure that we're using our own data for performance management, that we're regularly reviewing that and evaluating that. And so we want to make sure that we're updating our board on the strategies that are contained in the community action plan regularly.
And of course, another key component of CSBG and managing it well is Roma and the results-oriented management and accountability cycle. And so that's kind of what we touch on here with this slide. Effectively, what we're doing with the community needs assessment within the framework of the Roma cycle is using our results to determine our future plans. So we're gathering these demographic profiles and this information throughout the process. And this really helps provide context that we need to become better at projecting outcomes. And it also helps us determine which services helped us achieve these outcomes historically, ultimately determining our impact. So effectively, we're in the evaluation, assessment, and planning phase of the Roma cycle here. So often we start with planning, but really we're taking it a step back here with the community needs assessment and starting with that evaluation piece, really analyzing the data, comparing it with our historical benchmarks and our historical data, and then we're assessing it with the community needs assessment so that it can subsequently inform our planning and the next phases of the Roma cycle.
So we're going to start out with evaluation of past performance in an environmental scan. What were the major findings in the previous needs assessment that you all conducted locally? What did you provide through the community action plan previously? Who received those services? Who benefited from the strategies and service implemented? Did you have any major changes to your previous 3-year community action plan? And should those changes be considered to move forward? What progress have you made towards the goals in your previous 3-year community action plan? And how might this 3-year community action plan process further those goals? What data do you need to collect to be able to prove that along the way? Are there any local theories of change in place for those with low incomes or low income neighborhoods, or for a collection of agencies that are working together? You want to consider that as you go through this process. And are there ultimately any other environmental or any local issues that need to be considered as you're doing this needs assessment process? Ultimately, we want to be able to clearly understand and clearly state how those with low income and or low income neighborhoods are benefiting from CSBG locally.
So ultimately, what we're trying to do with this process is measure the impact and the changes that are being realized as a result of the strategies and services that we've been providing, with the hope of identifying which services and strategies achieve optimum results for low-income individuals and families and or low-income neighborhoods. So part of that discussion then becomes the strengthening versus abandoning discussion, which strategies and services are providing optimum results, and is it worth it to strengthen those services and put more resources into them in order to provide even more results and even more impact? And then there's the question of services and strategies that maybe aren't as effective as we'd hoped, and at that point, do we strengthen those and try to achieve those outcomes, or do we look at abandoning them? So often there's this tension between what we had hoped to accomplish, what we've actually accomplished, and we have to determine for ourselves, in order to achieve those optimum results, which strategies are really helping us get there that we should strengthen, and which are potentially making us less efficient, less effective, less impactful, that may need to be abandoned. And so hopefully that's a key outcome of this whole community needs assessment, is really honing in on the strategies and services that are serving our communities best. And we should also look at the measurement tools that are being used to capture evidence of success. Are they efficient, right? These are the last few columns on our logic model, where we kind of really lay those out on paper. And, are we capturing what we want to capture effectively? Are we able to show that we have achieved outcomes? And are we able to document those outcomes appropriately? If not, we may need to look at different measurement tools, or using the tools differently in order to really get the data and the information that we need in order to analyze the effectiveness of our strategies. And Dr. Reginald Carter has some fantastic questions that it is helpful to answer as we're doing this cost-benefit analysis effectively. And if we plan to continue with the service, then we should be able to answer these questions clearly. And that'll help us understand how successful the services have been in the past, and potentially how effective they could be in the future. And these questions are: how many clients did we serve? Who were they? What services did we give? Etc. And then we also have a couple of bonus questions, and specifically the social return on investment is a really interesting question to answer, and it can also be a complicated question to answer. So that is a field that we're going to touch on in our CSBG regional forums coming up in 2023, where we're going to hope to gather people on site to really delve into things like social return on investment and some other topics as well. So those will be coming up. You'll be hearing information about that as time goes on. If you have any questions, of course, about the social return on investment before that, or the regional forums, please don't hesitate to reach out.
So let's dive into the data now. There's two basic types of data that you all will need to collect, and you need to collect and analyze both in order to meet organizational standard 3.3. The qualitative data, this is going to provide the narrative data from the community and or customers. It provides the depth and the breadth of an issue or a need. Remember, qualitative data is based on language. This can be obtained through a variety of tools, and we're going to highlight some more of these tools in the following slides. We then have quantitative data. This is going to provide the scope of an issue or a need and is based on numbers or counts. Qualitative data can be analyzed and aggregated to provide quantitative data as well. For example, how many respondents felt positive or negative about an issue and need can be aggregated to turn qualitative data into quantitative data.
We'll go ahead and start with digging into qualitative data a little bit. There are primary sources for this data, like primary customers who are actually receiving services. And then we also have secondary customers, which is a much wider swath of entities, which includes folks in the community, partner agencies, funders, other stakeholders effectively. And they can all provide different valuable context to the needs and perspectives of our community. And a great example of qualitative data is customer satisfaction surveys. And we have a survey linked here that we can look at, and it's pretty straightforward. So this is the survey that a direct recipient of services might receive, and it gives you insight as to their satisfaction. And of course, it is something that is required by Org Standard 1.3 and 6.4. So this can be a valuable component to the community needs assessment process. And then we also have agency and community surveys, which are for anybody in the community, especially key stakeholders, and can also be current or prospective customers, advisory committee members. And this is a little bit more thorough potentially, but this is effectively, a mini community needs assessment based on an entity or an individual of one, and really gathering information on what they think are the needs in the community. And it is interesting to note that the first question on here has a great example of some of the relevant stakeholders that you may want to ensure that you're reaching. Public sector, private sector, it's got a lot of really great examples. So if you're, box checking, making sure you have all of these things in there, that's a helpful thing to have there. So hopefully you've gathered input by the end of this process from all of those stakeholders. And then, of course, key informant surveys can be a helpful tool, including group prioritization exercise for customers or your tripartite board or advisory committee, and also focus groups, forums, and interviews, which can be conducted with individuals or groups, or potentially even specific stakeholder groups like private business or a specific audience that you really want to have focused feedback from.
Okay, let's switch over to quantitative data. So obviously this is going to be data that is specific to counts and other types of community-wide or customer or population-wide type of indicators. We have some really great resources in here that we strongly encourage you all to utilize. The first is going to be the National Data Hub that the Community Action Partnership puts together. You'll have to create a login, a free login, to access this resource. Again, strongly encourage you to do that. You can either run a needs assessment report or a housing assessment. The housing assessment report is very, very detailed around housing. You'll have to select Colorado, obviously, and then select the service areas by county that you all serve with CSBG. Today and this afternoon in our presentation, we're going to be using Baca County as an example of what type of resources we might look at. And so we're bringing up just a really quick report on the income in Baca County. And this report provides a wealth of information, but there's some key things that you're going to want to consider as you go through this. And one of those is going to be, as Alex emphasized earlier, that we need to look at poverty by age, by gender, and by ethnicity and race. And so this report in the income section is going to provide all those different types of indicators to be able to clearly show that you analyze poverty and its prevalence amongst the age, gender, race, and ethnicity. So really important resource there. I do want to bring up the full report. If you were to select all indicators, again, this report is for Baca County. You can see that it gets to be a really huge report, but it is very, very valuable information. So we encourage you to look at all the different areas in this report. For instance, you can look at some technology and internet access data indicators in this report. How many households don't have a computer? How many households have a computer and some sort of internet connection? How do these folks, how many actually use those types of resources? Very valuable data to consider as you're going through the assessment here. So that's the Community Action Partnerships Data Hub. And we, again, strongly encourage you all to look at that resource and download the report for your service areas. Let us know if we can assist. The next big resource that you all should definitely tap into for quantitative data is the State Demography Office in DOLA. And on their landing page at the Demography Office, there's a whole bunch of data indicators that you all can look at. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's data tools and resources. And we have a specific report that we had DOLA put together specific for you all as CSBG agencies. So if you click on that report, you'll get brought to a page where you can select your agency. Once you select your agency and view the profile, it'll bring up all these different indicators that are largely different than what are in the National Community Action Partnership Data Hub report, and also can be extremely valuable. And so I'm going to show you real quickly what that final report looks like. You can get a Word document that provides these different areas. And for instance, one of the indicators is the age by poverty level for persons with disability. This is really good data for you all to consider as you're going through your needs assessment, and it's not readily and easily accessible usually, but we made sure it was very, very accessible for your service areas in this report. Also want to make note of the Census Bureau's website and the American Community Survey webpage within the Census Bureau, and both provide really good information that can be gotten all the way down to the county level. For instance, brought up one of the American Community Survey topics here, and this happens to be looking at different social indicators within Baca County. Some really interesting information. One of the things I gravitated when I looked at this was around grandparents responsible for grandchildren and how long they've been responsible for grandchildren. I think, again, interesting indicator to consider as you're looking at the needs within your community. And finally, don't forget about your own internal data that you all have locally. This is quantitative data about the needs of your customers, the services you provided, the outcomes you achieved on their behalf or they obtained through the services strategies you're providing. You could look at partner databases locally. Partner agencies probably similarly collect quantitative data that they can likely aggregate and provide to you to be able to analyze. And then also, please do look for any shared local community databases that you could tap into as you're looking for both qualitative and quantitative data in this process.
Alrighty, next we touch on other key sectors. Per Org Standard 2.2, we are required to gather information from key sectors in the community, which include community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, private sector, public sector, and educational institutions. Again, I want to just make a note that the way we read this and sort of enforce it at the state level in Colorado is that it's all of these. So it's not just some of them, but hopefully data and insight from all of these sectors will be incorporated in order to fully say that the organization has met this standard. So examples of community-based organizations include their partner customer data, other organizations who have their own customer data that they can share, as well as case manager interviews. Often the folks who are providing services most closely or working most closely with clients can have really good insights onto the conditions and the needs of the folks that you're working with. So case manager interviews can be a really helpful source of information. Faith-based organizations also often have their own community needs surveys or even resource mapping exercises that can be tapped into as additional resources. The private sector, of course, does a lot of reporting, and so there's worker retention analysis, economic development focus groups that can be done, and a lot of white papers and other type of research products exist from the private sector that can also help inform the community needs assessment. And then educational institutions often have valuable insight into the issues that we're dealing with in the community needs assessment, to include free and reduced lunch data, student resource officer surveys. Again, the folks closest to the students or the populations that we're working with here often will have potentially anecdotal, qualitative type information that we can incorporate and really glean some valuable insights from. And then there are some other public and other resources, and I will just say the ones on this slide are very area specific. So for example, if you're in the southwest corner of the state, you may not find a lot of value in the Denver Housing Stability Action Plan, but if you're in Denver, you may, right? So these are resources listed here on the slide, but not necessarily included in our other resources because they are very regional and geographically specific. So some entities on the call today might have use for some of these, and otherwise, there's a lot of regions will have similar things for your specific area. So, if you see a transportation gap analysis for another area and you wonder if you have one in yours, you can take a look in your own area and see if that's something that's available for you to use in your community needs assessment. And these types of resources are often very helpful. We do encourage folks to, as much as possible, use really current data, because COVID has definitely shaken things up and it's changed the conditions and the data that we need to be gathering and assessing in order for it to be really relevant going forward. So please use current data as much as possible, and be sure to incorporate sources from outside your organization. And of course, it's fine if you use multiple resources from one source, as long as it's relevant and credible and as current as possible. So just some resources there for you to consider. And we will move on to the next slide.
Yeah, Alex, and we'll continue thinking about other key sectors that we'll want to consider and other resources. And obviously, our state and all the departments within the state are excellent sources of public sector data that you all can and should include potentially. And so want to look at a couple examples here. And again, these are all resources that you have access through this presentation. But for instance, the Colorado Department of Early Childhood has a really excellent data and reports page, and it has a Colorado Licensed Child Care Facilities report. So really interesting data to consider, I think, for any agency or department, looking at what child care is available locally, and you can get data that really covers your entire service area by county. Again, looking at Baca County here, and it gives some really great information on what child care facilities are out there and to what scope those resources are available locally. So a resource we strongly encourage you to look at. Keeping on the youth population here, we can also look at things like the kids count data that is available locally for different areas. And I'm going to go to the website real quick so you can see what that looks like. But when you download the report, there is a specific page for each county in Colorado. So again, you can drive down to your local service areas and see exactly what type of data is available for your service area. And again, we encourage you to really look at different populations within your community and use these resources that are already out there and really drive down to local data. So obviously we don't need to consider all of this, right? We don't expect you to receive community needs assessment reports that have data from every single one of these resources or multiple data indicators from every single resource, but we do encourage you to go out there and investigate what's available and what makes sense to you locally to be able to assess and ultimately analyze and provide a report around. And so while you might not use all of these, we hope that you do consider multiple sources and that you do find really valuable data when you're going out through this process.
Indeed, and some more sources of potential valuable data include studies, plans, and standards. Many of these are public sources of that. To include a couple that we're going to highlight here, like the self-sufficiency standard, and there it is. So this is a valuable document that we have placed here. Lots and lots of data there to sort of comb through. And there you go. You can see there for Baca County specifically, that's been pulled, and you have, monthly costs associated with things, self-sufficiency, wages. So some fantastic data that can be meshed with the sort of poverty framework that we're looking at here to come up with some really valuable insights and needs determinations. And then we also love, I personally have for a long time really loved the MIT Living Wage Calculator. It's just such a thorough and straightforward resource for really determining what the living wage is in a given area, given a household size, and subsequently comparing that with your local data and seeing how those match up and what that matchup or mismatch potentially could say about the wages and the data and the needs in your own community. So for all kinds of applications, that living wage calculator can be a very helpful resource. And of course, there's these other ones there as well. The state of Colorado doing a bang up job providing all kinds of resources. So feel free to check those out at your own leisure.
So let's move on to community resource mapping and analysis. And as the federal statute specifically calls out, we must consider the needs and the resources in our communities and areas served. So some of the things that we will want to look at, and this is both available and lacking, by the way. So not just what's available and not just what's lacking, but both what you find and what you don't find. You might want to ask some questions. Are there any gaps in the resources in the community that you're serving? Are there any agencies and or programs with a similar approach to what you've taken or what you're considering to take? Are there any agencies, programs with similar mission statements that you're working under? Are there any resources that are threatened? What resources are plentiful and widespread? Again, are there any local theory of change approaches that have a collective impact approach to poverty in the areas served that should be considered as you go through this process? And we do have a couple of great resources on here. There's a visual of a resource map that Eagle County did a few years ago. I'm going to go ahead and bring that up and quickly look at this example of what you might do around analyzing, mapping and analyzing resources. So Eagle County, when they went through this process, they identified the various agencies that partner in the community around different things. And that's on the left side of our matrix here. And then along the top, they looked at those 9 federal objectives, and they actually looked at education broken up by kind of population and education. So you see multiple education columns here. But you'll notice the rest of these are the standard CSBG domain/federal objectives that you would expect to see. So they went through a process and contacted their various partners in the community and identified not only the resources that are out there amongst the major domains, but how many of those resources are available out there locally amongst their partners that they could really look at. And really to be able to provide a very strong map of not only the resources that are out there, but also, for instance, the resources they're not finding. In this example, there weren't any resources identified under income management. So again, looking at resources that are available, but also looking at resources that are lacking. And then we also wanted to turn your attention to the Colorado Center for Law and Policy's Human Services Gap Map. Again, a really excellent resource for some data specific to your county served. And for the Baca County example here, you see this really great dashboard that gives you a quick, very visual indicator of some major areas we see caseload and eligibility around. The Child Care Assistance Program, CCAP, 7% of eligible population enrolled, seeing 278 estimated eligibility and only 19 reported caseload. Colorado Works, 39% enrolled versus eligible. Medicaid, 91% enrolled versus eligible locally. SNAP, 48%. WIC, undetermined, but the caseload's 135. So again, really interesting, very locally driven data that you can consider as you go through your needs assessment process.
Next, we talk about one of my favorite things, which is inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. This is something that we're really trying to focus on in a way that I think historically hasn't necessarily been the case. So it's new and different, and so it's a learning process for everybody. So we've tried to provide some resources that'll be a good start for starting to incorporate considerations of these things into your needs assessment. And we start with something that we want to highlight, the empowerment scores. So this is a resource that really breaks down by demographic or breaks down data into the factors that we can consider when we're really trying to ensure that we're being equitable and inclusive when it comes to the various factors that impact poverty, right? And really ensuring that we're incorporating these considerations into the needs that we identify. So there's issues of poverty, race, all kinds of things on here. So I would encourage folks to just kind of play around with that and see sort of what the empowerment score is for your area and what that leads to as far as your analysis. And oftentimes what we're doing here is seeing how these various issues are reflected from a population perspective in our areas, and it's helpful to compare that with our actual client service data as an example, right? So if the population has a certain proportion of folks who are disabled or of a certain race, are we also seeing that reflected in the people that we're serving? Or is there a mismatch there where we could potentially be more inclusive and more equitable in the populations that we're actually seeing outcomes with? And also, determining which populations are receiving outcomes. Is there potential inequity built into the folks who are seeing changes and who are seeing, sort of positive trajectories versus those who are not? And starting to incorporate those kinds of analyses. Of course, we want to make sure that we're gathering input from populations who may be marginalized or discriminated against as much as possible to ensure that their voices and their needs are heard and incorporated into the needs assessment accordingly. Accessibility is a big concern, both with the surveys that we're putting out. Are the surveys accessible? Are our services accessible? Are our physical facilities accessible, right? There's so many factors that go into ensuring accessibility with our programs and with the needs that we identify. So that's an important consideration as well. And we have some awesome tools here. I believe this is the Colorado Equity Alliance Tools and Resources page here. Another fantastic Colorado resource that has some resources specific to us in the state. And so as you're starting to look at incorporating these sort of EDI principles into your needs assessment, that can also be a great place to start. Alrighty, moving on.
So now that we have the data that we wanted to grab, including probably some extra data that we noticed along the way would be impactful and useful to have, we need to start analyzing it. So raw data is just data until it's analyzed, and we need to analyze it to make this information, this data useful. So this is a very important part of the process. Collecting it is the first step, and then really analyzing it is the important step that we move on to. What are some major takeaways from the data that was collected and analyzed? What are the causes of poverty? Causes of poverty are defined as a negative factor that creates or fosters barriers to self-sufficiency and/or reduces access to resources in communities in which individuals with low income reside. What are the conditions of poverty? Conditions of poverty are defined as a negative environmental, safety, health, and/or economic condition that may reduce investment or growth in communities where individuals with low incomes reside. What are customer demographic profiles compared to those experiencing poverty in the community overall? What are the most important issues that we've identified? Where might CSBG funds have the greatest impact? At the bottom of this slide, you can see some analyzation techniques that are very common out there. The 5 whys, we probably encountered this quite a bit. You can think of the toddler that continues to ask the question of why until they feel like they got to a sufficient answer. A force field analysis, a really visual tool that you can use to see where positive and negative forces are interacting within your community around different issues. And a trend analysis, certainly something that you'll do as you obtain and analyze the data is look at trends. Even within your own internal data, you can do trends analysis.
So once we've done this extensive work and resource and compilation, we don't just file this thing away. We want to make sure that we're communicating the results of the assessment, both to the community and agency stakeholders to ensure that they're shared with partner organizations, other sectors in the community at large, and of course the tripartite board and advisory committee throughout, but that's a given. And you can do that in a lot of ways. You can put it on your agency or program website, Facebook page, or other social media platforms, electronic reports, which are emailed, printed copies, which can be distributed, and other social media distribution processes, or a good old press release. And of course, peer review is always helpful. And this is these things that we disseminate are assessments, not just compilations. Want to make sure that the key audiences, both that we've interviewed along the way and that we're going to be interfacing with going forward, have this information. And we can even parse it further into specialized products that may be specific to a specific service strategy or an audience. And then, of course, we turn that assessment into action with our community action plan, et cetera. So we really want to make sure this is no small task, and you all are doing a lot of work. So as much as possible, ensuring that those who are impacted or those who could even potentially also find the information valuable have access to that for their own needs, services, strategies, and community needs assessment of their own.
So eventually, we're going to then need to move from this needs assessment that's been analyzed, formalized, and accepted by the Tripartite Board Advisory Committee into a community action plan. And this is really a plan that clearly demonstrates how CSBG is going to be used in the future coming period of performance, and how the agency is going to account for those CSBG funds. It's really intended to be reviewed against actual results and impacts. So again, when we create our community action plan resulting from this needs assessment, we want it to be measurable. We want to be able to see success based on what we did and the outcome indicators that we plan to obtain through our efforts. This is a living process that's encompassed again in that Roma cycle, and it can drive into a Roma logic model where we really clearly outline the services, strategies, and the outcome indicators, along with the measurement tools that we're going to use to show our success and what we achieved as far as change, positive change in the community goes. And oftentimes, we'll include information about linkages and other leveraged resources, because we know that CSBG does not do everything usually on its own locally. So we'll want to talk about that through the process.
So bada bing, bada boom, just like that, you're done. Easy peasy. No, there will be more, and we will provide more resources, emails, et cetera, communication. But that's the high level, broad strokes about the community needs assessment. So one of the principles and frameworks that really helps us do a community needs assessment really well is Roma. And on that note, we have some in-person Roma trainings coming up. We have April and June, sorry, not in person, these are virtual. April and June virtual Roma trainings that are 3 days on separate weeks, 3 hours each, so 9 hours total. And it's a really good time. And we highly encourage anyone who hasn't done it for a while, or new staff folks, board members, all kinds of people to do the Roma training, because it's hugely valuable. And it has a lot to say about the community needs assessment and ways that we can perform that really effectively. So if you're interested in signing up for that, you can certainly click that link in this slide, or you can reach out to generally the folks at the CCA, since they manage that registration, and get yourself or someone that you work with on that training.
Absolutely, Alex. Look forward to seeing folks at all our Roma trainings this year. And we are planning a couple in-person trainings as well. So look to those to be publicized, but a really good practice to attend, have your stakeholders go through Roma and understand Roma practices and principles as you go through this process. We also, as Alex mentioned earlier in the presentation, have our community action regional forums coming up this spring and summer, taking our show on the road to 10 different communities. We're going to be doing it in person. It's a one-day convening. We're going to talk about more in depth, moving from the needs assessment to action planning and implementing different strategies and services, and how we be very accountable and transparent around that. We'll answer questions about what possible outcomes we're trying to obtain and what success actually looks like based on our plans. So really, this is going to be that next step moving forward after you get done with your needs assessment and you're really starting to put together your community action plan and other action planning products based on your needs assessment. So look forward to seeing you all in person, hopefully, this spring or summer in a community within an hour and a half to 2 hour drives of you, and we'll be feeding you. So I look forward to it.
Fantastic. And now we're in the questions phase, and one brave soul has put a question into the chat. Karen, thank you so much for it with Moffat County United Way. And Karen asked, would 2014 to 2016 be an acceptable data time frame? That is what was on the gap map. What do you say, Josiah?
Well, obviously we want to be as recent and up to date as possible when we look at these sources. Some sources may be older, and that's okay. And also it's helpful to think about what the data elements that are being addressed are. Obviously, we do, for instance, the US Census every 10 years. So look, we just went through one in 2021. So you all are going to be considering new census data. But as we go along, that census data will age and age, but we will still consider it along the way. So that's largely a judgment call locally, I believe. But obviously, we want to have as recent and relevant data as possible.
Yeah,
thanks
absolutely.
for the question.
Thank you. Hayden, I see you have your hand up. You're on mute. Can you hear me, Hayden? You're on mute. Here we go. Okay, you might be off now. No, alas.
I would say, Alex, the one thing that we'll want to emphasize again is that we're available for training and technical assistance, and certainly available to get much more in depth with you all on the product that you're putting together and that you're planning. And so think of this as the start along the way, and reach out to us and let us know how we can assist.
For sure. And we did get Hayden's question in the chat. Thank you, Hayden. Do we need to define a difference between generational poverty and situational poverty? What would you say, Josiah?
I think something we would always probably want to consider. There's a big difference between how we would approach those two situations and the populations that we would probably be serving between those two. And if anybody doesn't know the difference, reach out and we can talk about that and get more in depth into the difference between generational poverty and situational poverty. And I think when we think about that in our network, we think about time frame and when are we doing certain things and in which way. And so certainly situational poverty, we may be looking at more emergency or one-time services, versus generational poverty, where we may be looking at more community strategies or more long-term assistance to a household, family, or individual. So the different approaches that each take is going to require probably different data for each of those populations that are generally served. So I think it's good to consider, and it's a good question.
That's a great question. And could that potentially also be an example of information that it would be relevant to put in the causes and conditions of poverty section? Maybe.
Absolutely, right. I think when you think about generational poverty, you want to understand what is the causes of some of that generational poverty. How do we interrupt those? How do we intervene in a way that helps to break those generational causes of poverty versus situational causes of poverty, which are probably different. And again, I think both conditions of poverty and those two types are probably different depending on what community you're in.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you everybody for the questions. We are so prompt, 2:59. It's almost like we planned it. Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for being here. We know that that was a lot of information, and then these are very large projects. We appreciate your work and effort, and we know that it's not something to be undertaken lightly. Please don't hesitate to reach out with whatever questions you have, concerns, no matter how small. We are here to help, and we genuinely appreciate all of your work and effort on this. So with that, I will bid everyone adieu.